time to sit back, enjoy, engage, and Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is that good? Yeah. Nods. That's great. Well, good evening. Thanks for coming back. It's always encouraging when one or two people come back. It's always a good sign. So thank you. In our second session, last time we looked particularly at the role or the function of the Damascus Road for Paul, and how that was such a determining event in his life, a real before and after, how it functioned in some ways as a call to be an apostle to the Gentiles, but also perhaps as a conversion moment. But it depends what we mean by a conversion. And you may remember that we said if anything, Paul is more Jewish post-Damascus Road than he is pre-Damascus Road. So yes, Paul becomes a follower of Jesus Christ. But if that means leaving behind his Judaism, that's certainly not the case. Tonight we're going to press those aspects of them more, particularly around the notion of Paul as a theologian. How does Paul's letters shape how we understand who God is, who Jesus Christ is, and maybe even who Paul thinks the Holy Spirit is? We'll try and be Trinitarian in that aspect. And that's what does it mean for Paul to be a theologian? I just want to take us back to that kind of theme verse we started with last week from 2 Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 16. From now on, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. We'll say more next time, particularly about who Paul thinks Jesus or Jesus Christ is, and particularly what the significance of Jesus' death is for Paul. But I wonder, at the very least, this reminds us that for Paul, what he believed about Jesus Christ mattered. That made a kind of key difference to him. There was a time when he knew Christ differently to how he knows Christ in the present. In order to show that, I wonder if it was worth saying something about the pre-Damascus Road, Paul. What do we know about this particular figure? And many scholars, many writers speak of a kind of a triangle or a triad of Paul. 3 parts: a Greek part, a Roman part, and a Jewish part. And those 3 elements come together to make the Paul that we encounter in the New Testament texts. So what do I mean by the Greek Paul? What do I mean by Paul the Greek? By Paul the Greek, I mean he is a diaspora Jew. Diaspora, is that a term that people have come across? Diaspora, you're dispersed, you're spread abroad. We often talk about an African diaspora or a Chinese diaspora, those who are outside of their home context. We know from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, that many Jews went into exile, went away from Jerusalem, went away from Palestine, out into all parts of the ancient Near East. Some came home, but many just stayed where they were and got on with life. And that was what we might call kind of a Jewish diaspora, those who kind of left the Holy Land and now dispersed across Greece, across Turkey and the like. We're not entirely sure where Paul is from, but we're pretty clear he's not from Jerusalem. He's from outside of Palestine. We're told he comes up to Jerusalem to study with the Rabbi Gamaliel. Well, that seems to be from afar, kind of going off to university, so to speak. His hometown is probably Tarsus. That's at least what we're told in the book of Acts, that Saul, Paul, is from Tarsus. Paul himself in his letters doesn't say. But Tarsus seems as good a guess as any. Tarsus is a fairly educated part of modern-day Turkey, or Asia Minor in the 1st century. And in the letter to the Galatians, when Paul recounts the events after his experience on the Damascus Road, he does a little bit of ministry around that neck of the woods. Then he makes an exodus back up to Asia Minor and spends at least 10, maybe even 14 years there, in what we know as the quiet years. We don't know much, if anything, about those quiet years. But where he goes is Tarsus. Or Tarsus is where that region goes. And I think, well, when your world's being turned upside down, when you've had this big encounter with the risen Jesus Christ, where do you go? You go home. You go where people know you. So Tarsus seems to me a fairly good guess, even if Paul himself doesn't explicitly say he's from there. But if he is a Hellenistic Jew, a diaspora Jew, that means that his Old Testament, his Bible, if I can use that phrase, would have been the Greek version of the Old Testament, not the Jewish version of the Old Testament. I suspect he knew a little bit of Hebrew, but when he went to his kind of bedside camp, when he's doing his kind of daily devotions in bed and he's getting his scrolls out, so to speak, he'd be reading it in the Greek form rather than in the Hebrew form. And that means that when he cites the Old Testament in his letters, and we'll look at a couple of examples of that, he cites the Greek form rather, and not the Jewish form. And as a diaspora Jew, as a Hellenistic Jew, as someone who's Greek, it seems that Paul is particularly interested or sympathetic to what does it mean to be God's people. I want to use it in a pagan world, when you're outside of that community that has shaped you. And that means that Paul will be particularly attentive to those things that mark you out as Jewish. So matters about being circumcised, going under the proverbial knife, keeping kosher, keeping the food laws, keeping Sabbath. If you're away from Jerusalem and you want to ensure your Jewish identity is defined and shown, you perhaps pay particular attention to those things which show that you're Jewish. I lived in Canada for 3 or 4 years. I had a lovely time there. It's a very, very nice part of the world. I think I felt more British in Canada than I did when I'm normally resident in Birmingham or London. I think I sang "God Save the Queen" more in Canada than I sang it in the rest of my life. That what mattered about my Britishness came more to the fore when I was away from my home context. So it means we shouldn't be surprised in Paul's letters to see him attending to those issues about what does it mean to be Jewish? What marks you out as the people of God? Is it circumcision that marks you out as the people of God? Is it keeping kosher that marks you out as the people of God? Is it keeping Sabbath that marks you out as the people of God? those identity markers become quite significant. So he's a Greek Jew. Another context also speak of Paul being a Roman figure. We're told in Luke's Gospel that he is a Roman citizen. And Rome's quite big at this time. Rome is the big power base. For Luke, it really matters that Paul is a Roman citizen. We see in Acts, Luke tells us of Paul going to Rome, a long journey to Rome. Well, he's going to have his moment before Caesar, which as a Roman citizen he can have. Paul himself doesn't mention that he was a Roman citizen. He may have been, he may not have been. So I think this part of the triangle for Paul actually isn't that important. I think I might have said last time that if Paul were a Roman citizen, might we have expected that to have cropped up in the letter to the Romans? When you're trying to commend yourself to someone, it might be a good little kind of thing just to kind of drop into the conversation. Oh yeah, I just happen to be a Roman citizen, but he doesn't say anything about that. So he may be, he may not be, I don't know. But most important, I think, aspect of this triad is that Paul is Jewish. Jewish through and through. And even more Jewish after Damascus Road rather than before it. So this is the kind of figure who we're going to be encountering. We're going to be looking a little bit at the letters that he writes and how we might do theology in the light of these letters. Someone who is Greek, who is Jewish, and maybe a little bit Roman, but that's not to be too important. Now, what we know of Paul, this may not be a surprise. What we know of Paul himself comes from his letters. That's our primary testimony from Paul himself. It's our primary access to Paul. He writes letters. And we kind of get a little window onto him through these epistolary texts. Interestingly, though, in Acts, there's no mention of Paul writing letters. It just might be that Luke doesn't mention it. What seems to be really important in the other parts of the New Testament, i.e. that Paul writes letters, doesn't get commented upon by Luke. Not sure what to make of that, just doesn't get mentioned. And the letters are all to what we might call his churches. Churches that he founded. Churches that he has in some way oversight over, or some kind of responsibility for. Churches that he kind of planted. With the exception of Romans. So the tone of Romans is a bit different. They don't know him. He's having to kind of commend himself. He's kind of having to butter them up a bit. We think that Paul wants to get Rome, the church around, to support him on a mission trip. A mission trip to Spain. And a bit like missionaries send letters asking for finance to support their missionary enterprise. Even today that happens, doesn't it? It may be that Paul's writing to Rome to kind of commend himself and bring the Romans on board. But it's not his church. So it's a slightly different tone. Whose church is Rome, do you think?
Peter.
I think we probably Peter, and certainly Peter in the tradition is associated with Rome. And therefore, in one sense, it may be that Paul is starting to tread on Peter's territory, perhaps. Is he trying to claim Peter's territory? That may be the case. However, I don't know if you've read 1 Corinthians recently, but as we'll see, the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians have references to a Cephas party or a Peter party. They're a group in Corinth who are identifying with Peter. And that makes you wonder, why in Greece do they know, or how do they know about Peter? Maybe it's because Peter's been to Corinth, checking up on Paul as well. So if Paul was trying to get on Peter's territory in Rome, maybe Peter's trying to get on Paul's territory in Corinth. What then are the limits? What are the features of these texts? What things might you want to say about this letter collection? It's limited in some ways just because of the type of discourse it is, or discourse that they are. And friends, if you take one thing away from tonight, take away this. Paul is dealing with situations as and when they arise. His letters are occasional and situational. They're responding to things that happen at that particular time. What we don't have is this nice, big, systematic theology on Paul's part. What we don't have is this nice, clear jigsaw puzzle with every piece in place. Instead, we've got bits, but only in part. Which means that we have, in many ways, what we might call accidents of inclusion. I.e., we have reference to things just because they were problems. So, for example, in the church in Corinth, there seems to be, when we read chapters kind of 12 through to 14 of 1 Corinthians, there seems to be in Corinth, the Corinthian church are misusing spiritual gifts, and particularly that speaking in tongues, or what's often called kind of glossolalia, speaking in foreign tongues. And Paul spends the best part of 3 chapters kind of responding to that and critiquing some of their practice. Those chapters have been very significant in recent church history. The Pentecostal movement, for example, has been very much been the kind of focal text for our Pentecostal sisters and brothers. But they're there in 1 Corinthians because the Corinthians are making a mess of them. So we have what we have because of what was going wrong rather than what was going right. So just be kind of wary of that. Secondly, we don't have the letters written to Paul. And as we see that there are letters written to him. As well as going out, there's some inbound communication. Now we can try and reconstruct what we think might have been in those inbound letters. But we don't have them. We can only guess. And that means we're only kind of listening in on one side of the conversation. My wife phones her mother almost every day, like a good daughter does. And we're in the living room, and my wife's on the phone, and I can hear my wife's kind of odd comment. Sometimes it's just a grin. Oh, yes, that's nice. Mother, thank you. I might get a sentence or two from my wife. And I can try and reconstruct the conversation, but all I can really hear is what my wife is saying. And in some ways, it's a bit like the letters that we've got from Paul. We can hear Paul's kind of response. What we don't have is what the churches are saying to him. And we can try and recreate that to an extent, but we need to be a bit cautious about what we're doing. And fourthly, there are Paul writes other letters. The letters that we have speak of other letters that he's written. We have reference to a letter to the church in Laodicea. We don't have that. As we'll see shortly, 1 Corinthians speaks of a letter that Paul had previously written to Corinth. So actually the text we know as 1 Corinthians is 2 Corinthians. The text we know as 1 Corinthians is actually the 2nd Corinthians. Okay, so more about that in a moment. So there's just some ways you need to kind of contextualise the letters that we're receiving. So as a window on that, I've tried to kind of construct a bit of a progress of those texts to the church in Corinth. In our New Testament, we have two letters to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. I don't want to overly confuse you, but I think there may well be, in reality, 5 Corinthians. Let's see where we get from that. Firstly, in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says, I wrote to you in my letter. I.e., there's been a previous letter already. There's been a letter before 1 Corinthians. So the text we know as 1 Corinthians is 2 Corinthians. Then we get to 2 Corinthians, the text that we know as 2 Corinthians, where Paul says in chapter 2, and I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who can only rejoice. For I wrote you out of much distress and anguish or sorrow. So it seems that between the text we know as 1 Corinthians being sent and the text which we know as 2 Corinthians being sent, there's another one in the middle, this so-called sorrowful or distressing letter. So that means, I think, that the text we know as 1 Corinthians is 2, because it's got the previous letter. There's this sorrowful letter in the middle before 2 Corinthians, which actually is 4 Corinthians, is written. It's great, isn't it? Where does Dave get 5 Corinthians from? If you get a chance to read 2 Corinthians, and I would commend it to you, I think it's often the forgotten letter within the Pauline discourse. It's a very full letter. But if you do read it, you'll notice there's a very, very, very clear break at the end of chapter 9 and before the start of 10. It's almost like there's two letters that have been sewn together, being kind of put together. And thus there'll be many of us, I think myself included, who would think that 5 Corinthians is actually chapters 9 to 13 of canonical 2 Corinthians. This may just serve to confuse you. But hopefully in some ways it illustrates just some of the caution we need to take when we're engaging with these texts. It's just a little bit harder than often we might think. The other kind of limit, or just sort of thing I want to consider, is the questions of authorship. And you may or may be aware that there is often some kind of questions posed as to whether Paul wrote all of the letters that the New Testament credits to him. And depending on which writer or commentator or author you read, they'll have different views of whether Paul did write it, or actually whether someone's written it in his name, maybe in a generation or so afterwards. They might say, well, there's different types of language used. They might say, it's a long word for the day, eschatological Cool. It's quite pretty teething for that, don't you? What's happening at the end? When does one come before the heavenly arena? When does eternal life happen? There's some differences in the Pauline literature accordingly. Some writers will point to a different type of theological argument present within the letter. But some will also say the letters don't quite fit into a chronology. So, for example, the epistle to called Titus, one of the later texts in the New Testament. They're addressing to a figure called Titus, who lives on the Greek island of Crete. And Paul writes to Titus to offer him some advice in respect to the problems that the church which Titus is looking after is having. There seems to be some kind of false teaching. There's a few kind of problems that are going on. Paul writes a kind of a pastoral letter to help Titus in that regard. Titus is on Crete. We don't know in Acts of Paul having the opportunity to get to Crete and to found a church, leave it, putting Titus in charge, for things to go wrong, and then for Paul to write to Titus about those things that have gone wrong. So if Paul were to have written to Titus, we've got to fill in some extra kind of biography, some extra kind of chronology to enable the church to be founded. So something a bit suspicious about that also. You've got to do extra work to do. So if we were to put our kind of barometer, our kind of stake in the ground, these 7 texts are the ones that the commentators generally say are genuinely Paul. This is the one that Paul of Tarsus wrote. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and don't forget Philemon. Usually a really short letter. It's the one that is often forgotten. But this is the 7 that they kind of gravitate towards. And that's the other 6, which are named as being written by Paul. They're given this label of Deutero-Pauline, kind of a second Paul, kind of after Paul, written by the generation after him in his name. Now, we can sit and debate on that, and you'll get different writers with kind of different views. I mean, I myself would want to put Colossians into the genuine Paul. I'd want to say that Ephesians, even if it wasn't written by Paul, does a pretty good, fine job of summing up Paul's views. Even if he himself didn't write it, we've done a fine job of making it look like Paul. 2 Thessalonians, I've no idea. Not many people know much about 2 Thessalonians anyway. I think it crops up much in the lectionary. People kind of just tend to ignore it. And it just generally gets ignored, really. So page money takes your choice. But it tends to be that when we're talking about Paul the theologian and trying to engage with his letters, this is the 7 that gets privileged, or they get the particular kind of focus upon them. And it's this 7 that we're going to work with for the rest of the evening. So let's just pause there. Okay. Let's then turn to some nitty-gritty about that, and I'm going to try and do a bit of a speed through those letters which are attributed to Paul, and a little bit of a flavour of what might be some of their salient features. Clearly, it's not going to be an exhaustive journey, but hopefully a few kind of headlines, a bit of a flavour, just of the diversity that we get in the Pauline literature. Different approaches to different places. let's begin with 1 Thessalonians. Why? Because it's generally regarded to be the first epistle that Paul wrote. And therefore, we think, the earliest Christian text. It's generally agreed that Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels, at least in the form that we have, the written form that we have of the Gospels. So 1 Thessalonians is Paul's first letter, and Paul writes first. This is the earliest Christian text in that regard. Now, the font on my computer was really bitsy, and I couldn't get it any bigger. Thessalonica is up here on the Ignatian way that travels through Greece into Asia Minor. And what's going on in 1 Thessalonians? It seems that particularly the first couple of chapters, the reason for the letter is that Paul's made a swift exit. He's kind of gone out the back door one night without telling anyone. And the first couple of chapters are him kind of trying to apologise, justify why he had to make a swift exit. And it seems that he was getting some particular opposition from a particular group in Thessalonica. And basically he says, for my own protection, I just had to get out quickly. He lays on quite thickly about how wonderful and how excellent the church in Thessalonica is doing, and how they are a model for all believers across Asia Minor. You kind of think there's a slight kind of apologetic element to it. But the first couple of chapters, he's really just trying to justify this swift exit, and therefore emphasising what he's done for them and how wonderful they are. And once he's kind of made this kind of apology, once he's got back in their good book, so to speak, he turns into 2 particular areas. Firstly, around appropriate relationships. Some of the matters around sexuality, some of the texts might derive from 1 Thessalonians 4 around kind of marriage and some of the difficult questions there. And also some discourse around the world of work and how does one spend one's time working. Well, that comes up into a primary question that Thessalonians seem to have for Paul. What about those who have died? Particularly, what about those who died since the Gospels arrived in Thessalonica and before Jesus is coming again? Why is that an issue? It's an issue because in Thessalonica, the earliest Christian text, the sense is that Jesus is coming soon. Jesus is coming at lunchtime. Jesus is coming at coffee time. Jesus is coming imminently. The expectation of Jesus coming, or coming again, what they call the second coming, seems to be very high in the early 50s. The expectation that Jesus will return seems fairly prominent in the life of the early church. It kind of dims over time. And by some of the later New Testament texts, we might see more attention to actually remind people that Jesus is coming again and to prepare for his coming. But in the early 50s in the Thessalonians, where there's very high expectation Jesus is coming again, their kind of question to Paul is, well, what about those who have died? Are they going to miss out on whatever Jesus is doing when Jesus kind of returns? So very, very high expectation of Jesus coming again. Secondly, 1 Corinthians, or canonical 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians as we might talk about it in reality, but we'll call it 1 Corinthians for a moment. Again, apologies for the small font. Corinth in the top right corner, so some way from the way the gospel has started down in Jerusalem. Perhaps a better or clearer map here. Corinth at this very kind of thin piece of land between Athens and the rest of Greece here. I think the geographical term is an isthmus. My geographers will know more about that. Very strip of land. The kind of Corinth is a entry point to the rest of Greece. When I'm lecturing on Corinthians, I compare it to Milton Keynes. Is anyone here from Milton Keynes? Okay, we can be rude about Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes is a new town. It's got lots of roundabouts. It's a bit nouveau riche. It's not got class or history. Corinth is a bit like that. It's a bit new money rather than old money. It's got any history, darling.
A big trading centre. They would have met a lot of other nationals, I think, in Corinth. There would have been a lot of foreigners coming in.
Lots of coming, yeah. So that brings money. That brings money in more recently, and we see a real diversity of people and believers in Corinth. But it's still nouveau rich. It's kind of new money rather than old money. What goes on in the correspondence there between Paul and the Corinthians? 1 Corinthians divides really, really neatly into 2 halves. Really neatly into 2 halves. With the first half, chapters 1 to 6. Now, Paul tells us that Chloe's people have reported to him what's going on in Corinth, and all is not well. Chloe, it seems, is if Chloe's got people, that suggests that she's a fairly significant woman, a significant businesswoman perhaps. And maybe if her people are reporting to Paul, it may be that she is a sponsor, I won't say a patron of Paul, but patron is quite a masculine term. You can say a matron, that's a very different form. She's maybe a financial sponsor for Paul. And her people have been in Corinth and come to Paul and say, actually, Paul, it's all getting a bit difficult in Corinth. You need to know what's happening in your church. And what they report back to Paul is severalfold. Firstly, that the church is inbuilt with factions. I follow Paul, I follow Peter, I follow Jesus, I follow Cephas. Lots of teams, lots of divisions, lots of separation. Wouldn't get that in the 21st century church, would we? God forbid. And as much of the first 4 chapters is kind of Paul dealing with those factions, reminding us or warning them against factionism, and emphasising very much the oneness of the people of God. Factions are bad, oneness is good. Paul's favourite number is 1. Also, closely people report back about some sexual immorality in the church there, and ask Paul to kind of adjudicate on a couple of matters in that regard. And they seem particularly also concerned about the ways in which disputes between members of the church are being conducted in public. It's not doing a very good job of modelling the gospel in terms of some of these external disputes. And then there's the second half, chapters 7 to 15, which begins about the matters which you wrote. So here we have evidence of an inbound communication to Paul, where the church in Corinth seemed to be wanting their apostle, their leader, to give a steer on matters, perhaps to unpack some things that he might have said to them. And so these 8 chapters, 7 to 15, seem to be Paul responding to the Corinthians' questions. They seem to have written to him about the questions about marriage and divorce, and what kind of Paul's views on those matters are. Paul always takes it on a number of a case-by-case basis through that chapter. What's interesting, particularly about this chapter 7, it's one of the very few times, that Paul quotes Jesus. It's possibly the only time that Paul quotes Jesus, which is just interesting. And it's interesting is where did Paul get that Jesus tradition from? And why just on that issue? Jesus talked, I think, about quite a lot of things. Why is it just in marriage and divorce that Paul cites Jesus' tradition? We'll say a bit more about that next time. They ask him about food sacrificed to idols. This seems to be a very hot potato. A hot potato sacrificed to idols. It's the hot potato issue in Corinth at the time. If you went down to the market to buy food, it had probably been food that had been sacrificed to an idol in a temple somewhere. The Corinthians want to know, is that polluting it? Are we okay to eat it? What do we do in those kind of contexts? And Paul sets out a number of responses in that regard. And in particular draws out the notion of what does it mean for them to eat together? This is where we get perhaps some of the first inklings of what we might call Eucharistic practice, of a common meal. The words of the institution that we have in our communion service occur in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And it seems that the church in Corinth are gathering for the meal together. But those who get there first are eating it before everyone else is gathered. And Paul's saying, just wait, everyone gathers, and then you have the common meal together. And thirdly, they seem to have a number of questions around worship. And a famous or infamous head coverings passage. When a woman prays, she must cover her head. We'll solve that one in a couple of weeks' time, of course. I'll bring my hard hat to cover my head. And they're difficult texts, and we'll try and grapple with them a little bit in a couple of weeks' time. But it's all under this kind of general umbrella of good worship. What happens in a worship context? Communion is also investigating that regard. And the so-called charismata, that's the posh word for the spiritual gifts, the gifts of prophecy, the gift of tongues, the gift of insight. It seems the Corinthians are misusing the charismata, they're misusing the spiritual gifts. And Paul's wanting to address that in the practice of worship. And chapter 15, the text which we read particularly on Easter Sunday, the great resurrection discourse of chapter 15. It seems that the Corinthians like matters spiritual. It seems the Corinthians think they are very spiritual people, that spirit is good. Paul's saying, you're not spiritual enough because you're not taking bodies into account. Bodies matter. We were. So an extensive reply by Paul on matters about which they've written to him. But there's chapter 16. There's chapter 16. I think if I was going to do my doctorate thesis again, I would do it on 1 Corinthians 16. It's a little extract just to remind us the value of reading to the end of every letter. You wouldn't just read a part of a book, would you? You'd read the whole book. If you're reading Paul's letters, read them all, particularly 1 Corinthians. A little extract, I think, is quite telling. I won't go there. Am I still there? Am I lost?
No, you're...
Am I back? He's back? Okay. If Timothy comes, see that he has nothing to fear among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord just as I am. Therefore let no one despise him. Send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I am expecting him with the brothers. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but he wasn't willing to come there. If Timothy comes, see that he has nothing to fear among you. Happy days. It seems that Timothy is the letter carrier. Timothy is the letter carrier of 1 Corinthians. He's the one that's being sent to Corinth as the kind of the postman, so to speak. And Paul's saying, when Timothy comes, don't shoot the messenger. I think that's an interesting window on just perhaps what the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians is. There really is some tension. Let no one despise him.
Don't kill the messenger.
Indeed, don't kill the messenger, don't shoot the messenger. One happy family? I'm not quite sure it is really. There was some kind of tension between Paul and the Corinthians. It seems the Corinthians really like Apollos. Apollos has been part of the community. It may be that they don't like Paul very much as an apostle, but they really like Apollos as their apostle. Maybe he's a great speaker. Maybe he's the great leader. Maybe he's a super apostle they would rather like. I wonder if this shows that actually Apollos is quite canny, quite savvy. He's aware that the Corinthians really like him, and if he goes, they'll latch onto him, and that actually undermines Paul. I think, well done, Apollos. You kind of pick up that your presence, actually you need to it's right to step back and not undermine what Paul is trying to do in Corinth. So pay attention to the last chapters. And after 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. The third, as we might say. Chapters 1 to 9, we see Paul trying to piece back his relationship with Corinth. Piece it back together, try and get them back on board, try and repair some of this disharmony. And much of the first 5 or 6 chapters are doing that. And as part of that, he does some exploration of the Christ of it. We'll say more about this next time. But it's perhaps here that Paul speaks of Christ as the new covenant, different from the old covenant. You may know that the Greek word for covenant is the same word as the Greek word for testament. So Christ is the new testament, the new covenant. And we see in chapters 8 and 9, Paul speaking about a collection, a bit like passing the bag around. It sounds like that the church in Jerusalem is undergoing some real time of famine and difficulty. And Paul takes on the responsibility to get a collection together to take back to support the mother church. And he tried to get kind of Corinth on board to give some money for it. as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a real kind of difference between the end of chapter 9 and the start of chapter 10. It's almost like a different letter. And Paul's tone changes. He calls himself a fool. And it's this rather long speech which we often call the fool's speech. And he attacks the other outsider apostles who are coming in to undermine his situation. He's really quite a rant at times. And Galatians. Or the first acorn or seed of Romans. Galatians and Romans are in many ways quite similar, dealing with similar issues. So people have often suggested that Galatians is the first draft of Romans, and the beta version, you might say, of Romans. And I think there's something in that, dealing with similar matters. It's in Galatians that the concept of justification by faith, which for many people, Martin Luther predominantly, was thought to be the centre of Paul's theology. Justification by faith, saved by faith, and not by the law. Justified by faith, and not by doing the law or the works of the law. What do I mean there? I think Paul's argument in Galatians is saying you're justified by faith or faithfulness, not by doing those works which the law requires you to do. Those works are not helping all people across the road, not kind of good deeds. They're those works which mark you out as Jewish. Circumcision, Sabbath keeping, food laws. It's not those that justify you, it's not those that save you, it's faith. It's your faith. And maybe even Jesus' own faith. And thus Galatians isn't speaking about how Gentiles are saved. It's saying, what must they do once they are saved? If you're a Gentile and you're going to be a follower of the way, do you have to go under the knife and get circumcised? If you're a Gentile and come to be a follower of the way, a follower of Jesus Christ, do you have to keep Sabbath? If you're a Gentile and you become a follower of the way, do you have to become Jewish? Paul says in a very loud no. It's faith. It's the Spirit. Get circumcised if you want, that's a good thing. Yeah. Kosher food, that's generally good, but that's not what being part of this new community is about. Instead, what it is about being marked out by the Spirit. The Spirit now marks out who the people of God. Great part of the middle of the letter. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? You've forgotten the Spirit. You've forgotten the Spirit. It's the Spirit that now marks out the people of God. The Spirit is the presence of God with God's people. And hence it's in Galatians that we find the discourse around the so-called fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, gentleness, kindness, self-control. I've probably missed out one or two others along the way. Those kind of fruits of the Spirit. The work of the Spirit in the life of the believer. Romans has a similar discourse, but I don't want to say too much about Romans other than that. I think it really matters in chapter 12, more about that next time. And finally, Philippians. A letter that Paul writes from prison. I think it's a bit of a farewell letter. I think Paul, in some ways, thinks he's going to go into his death. And he hopes he might get to see the Philippians again, but he thinks it's unlikely. So he wants to kind of give them some kind of final instructions about making them flourishing. He could be in prison in Rome, he could be in prison in Ephesus, and I think Rome personally, but pay your money, take your choice. And boy, does Paul love the Philippians. Boy, did the Philippians love Paul. It's just one big loving. There's problems in Galatia. There's problems in Corinth. There's a bit of problem even in Thessalonica. In Philippi, it's all one big loving. Why? Because they have the mind of Christ. Most famously in the so-called Christ hymn of Philippians 2, the great theme of unity in the letter. Philippians 2, 5 and 11. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. And though he is in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant or a slave, and being born in human likeness. And he humbled himself and became obedient even to the death on the cross. Some kind of downward trajectory. And then God exalted him and gave him a name that's above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. At the name of Jesus. Quite important. We think that actually this is a quotation from Isaiah 45, where it's at the name of God every knee shall bow, at the name of Yahweh, the Jewish God, that every knee should bow. What Paul has done is taken the worship that's gone to God is now being given to Jesus. Paul the monotheist has become Paul the duotheist, binitarian, the two God. Part of the evolution of the Trinity, I want to say. But still, even in Philippi, a couple of tensions. There are some outsiders coming in. Paul is far from polite about them. Beware of those dogs. Not very good Jewish speak. Beware of those dogs, he says. And there's a little kind of inter-church dispute between two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who seem to be causing division within the church, and Paul has to sort that one out. Just pause there for a couple of moments. Any points of kind of questions or comments on just a quick skim through those letters? At the back, sorry, Ben. And back in the corner.
It seems that these couple of points you just raised in the last couple of minutes are the point in history where the Christian church starts to develop from Judaism. Would you like to comment on that?
I would. I commented on several points, if that's okay. Firstly, we would want to talk about that in its early days, Christianity is a Jewish sect. And it would be quite hard. Many evangelical Christians would just be assumed to be Jews, so you just wouldn't notice any difference. Secondly, of course, over time, there starts to be what we would call a parting of the ways. But we now talk about partings, plural, of the ways. That parting may happen in different ways, at different times, different places. It may be in the 70s in some places, but it could be into the 2nd or 3rd century in a way. So there's not one fixed point where church and synagogue part. It's a more multidimensional in that regard. And thirdly, I'd want to suggest that one of the key points around which that division happens is the worship of Jesus Christ. The worship of Jesus Christ as God. That from very early in the life of Jesus, life of the church, Jesus is worshipped. It's one thing to follow Jesus, but to say that worship can be offered to him is a radical statement. Not the name of God every knee shall bow, but the name of Jesus every knee shall bow. And that seems to be happening quite early. And that text from Philippians 2, we think is a pre-existing hymn. We don't think Paul wrote this. We think this is something that they were singing in the churches quite early. So again, might date to the early 50s. So from very early in the life of the church, they're worshipping Jesus as God. A radical shift. My friend.
You're a dean of a seminary school, is that?
Yep.
Yeah. If someone handed in an analysis of the New Testament in the way that Paul analysed the Old Testament, what mark would you give them?
That's a brilliant question, my friend. If I hear right, I think I would want to. No. I think Paul reads the Jewish scriptures in the light of Jesus Christ. I think Paul is first and foremost an interpreter based on his own experience. The encounter with Jesus Christ causes Paul to read the scriptures differently. Let me give you an example. In every other first century interpreter, Abraham's great deed is the sacrifice of Isaac, or the offering of Isaac. That's kind of Abraham's kind of high point. Every first century interpreter calls that, whether it's the Apostle James in his letter, or Philo Alexander, or just his. That's the great thing that Abraham does, is the offering of Isaac. The one who thinks differently is St. Paul. For Paul, Abraham's great contribution is Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. Something has happened to cause Paul to read the Jewish scriptures differently from the training that he'd had, different from his peers, and that's in the light of his encounter with Jesus Christ. I think it's a perfectly good reading. There are other readings. So if someone handed me the essay, and I'd be able to say, well, what are you trying to do? What's your starting point? What's your kind of premise? What's your approach? What are you trying to do in that discourse? And if they say, well, I'm trying to offer a Christological or a Christ reading, I give them a good mark. Good question. Yeah.
Did I get this right? We say Paul's belief in the Messiah, following the Messiah, is a fulfillment of his Jewishness.
The question, was Paul's belief in Jesus as Messiah the fulfillment of his Jewishness? I think the answer to that is yes, of sorts. The encounter with the risen Christ on the Damascus Road showed for Paul that Jesus was alive, was risen, and that Jesus was God's Messiah. But actually that God's solution was a crucified Messiah. God's solution to Israel was a crucified Messiah. actually the problem for Paul pre-Damascus Road was the crucified Messiah. Messiahs don't get crucified. Messiahs lead to great victory. But God's plan was a crucified Messiah. So yes, I think Paul does think Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of Israel's hopes. But he needs to reconfigure his understanding of what it means to be Jewish. And I think I said, it's almost like he works backwards. If that's God's answer, what then is the problem? So yes, but in a reworked way. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Isn't Paul here saying Jesus is God? Jesus is not only human, Jesus is also God himself, a form of God.
Did Paul think Jesus...
Second person of God, if you like.
Did Paul think that Jesus was God? Yes.
Yes, I think so, from what he say there.
That Paul's theology is changed, is turned on its head. That's why Paul goes home to Tarsus. His world has been turned on its head. Everything he's understood about God is now turned on its head. One more question from the back, my friend.
Paul was a Pharisee.
Yep.
And the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. So, would it have made sense to Paul, Christ being resurrected from the dead? And is the Pharisees' understanding of the resurrection similar to the Christian one?
That's a good question. Paul's a Pharisee. He thinks he's a very good one. And the Pharisees are famously sympathetic to the notion of a resurrection. And we think that many of the earliest followers of Jesus, one of the earliest followers of the way, came from within the Pharisaical group. For that reason, they were already disposed to the idea of resurrection. And therefore, one might say that Paul's in accord with that. The caveat to that would be that the notion of a resurrection is what we might call a corporate one, a general one, that everyone would get resurrected. And in one sense, the problem or the surprise that it's just one. So therefore, kind of Paul recalibrates it as Christ's resurrection is the first fruits of a great resurrection of all to come. But that's one stage detached from the expectation that we find, say, in the book of Daniel, of a great and broader corporate resurrection. So Paul's halfway there, but only halfway, I would suggest. Just a few final thoughts. What type of theologian, or we might say, Paul is exhibiting? Paul is thinking on the fly. This is the early days of the church. Often Paul just gets asked, what do I... He tends to kind of make doctrine a bit on the fly as it goes. Because he's just dealing with some of those nitty-gritty pastoral situations. And he's being asked to give a view. And he's being asked to give a view in absentia. He's not on site. He's not there, but he's being asked to speak into the situation. And therefore that's no surprise that local conflict ensues. I think in all of Paul's letters there is some evidence of local conflict. It's messy out there. But at the same time, it's also very practical. It's geared to the particularity of the local church or context. Corinth is different to Rome, it's different to Philippi, it's different to Galatia, it's different to the situation in Thessalonica. And when we read Paul well, we want to take notice of actually what's kind of going on in the locality. And we might want to take account of the prior missionary preaching of Paul in those church contexts. All we have is the letter that Paul writes to the church. What we don't have is what he preached when he first came to bring the gospel to Corinth or Galatia. It would be really nice if we did. Because it may be that he's already told them verbally, and therefore doesn't need to put it in his letters. But we don't have access to that. What do the churches already know? We don't know. What we can be confident about, and I'm glad for that, the question there about the Jewish scriptures. It seems foundational to me that Paul the theologian starts with the Jewish scriptures. When trying to make sense of Jesus Christ, Paul starts with the Jewish scriptures. When trying to find the fulfillment of Israel's hopes, Paul starts with the Jewish scriptures. When trying to unpack who Jesus Christ is for him, Paul starts, and in many ways finishes, with the Jewish scriptures. On the handout, you'll find a few slides. I've got a few kind of themes which I'll let you explore in your own time, but I'm aware that our time has probably come to a close and we have warm homes to go to. So thank you for the conversation. I hope you will join us in a couple of weeks' time, in 3 weeks' time, when we'll say a bit more about Jesus Christ and who Paul thinks Jesus is.
Sure, I appreciate it today. Thank you very much.